The river surged with a fury Jake Forrester had never seen before, swollen and violent after 3 days of relentless spring rain. From atop his chestnut gelding, he spotted something impossible: a woman clinging desperately to a half-submerged wagon in the center of the raging Carson River. Her pale dress billowed around her like a water lily as she fought the current that threatened to sweep her away at any moment. Wyoming Territory, 1878. The land was still wild, unforgiving, and Jake was a man who kept to himself. At 32, he'd spent his adult life moving from ranch to ranch, never staying anywhere long enough to call it home. His latest job at the Broken Spoke Ranch had him riding fence lines and checking for strays when the storm hit. Without a second thought, Jake spurred his horse toward the riverbank. "Hold on!" he shouted, his voice nearly drowned by the roar of the water. The woman's terrified eyes locked with his. Her fingers, white-knuckled and trembling, clung to the splintered wood of what remained of her wagon. The horses were gone, likely swept downriver. How she had survived this long was nothing short of miraculous. Jake dismounted quickly, tying his horse to a sturdy cottonwood. He stripped off his coat, boots, and gun belt, calculating his approach. The current was deadly, but a fallen tree extended partially into the water about 20 yards upstream. If he could use it to get closer before swimming, he might have a chance. "I'm coming for you," he called out. "Just hold tight." The woman nodded weakly. She hadn't screamed or called for help, perhaps too exhausted or in shock. Her dark hair hung in wet ropes around her pale face, and even from this distance, Jake could see she was shivering violently. Jake scrambled onto the fallen tree, inching his way out over the churning water. When he reached the end, he took a deep breath and plunged into the frigid current. The force of it nearly took his breath away, but years of breaking horses had given him powerful shoulders and an iron determination. He fought against the river's pull, keeping his eyes fixed on the woman. For a terrible moment, he thought he might be swept past her, but with a final desperate lunge, his hand caught the edge of the wagon. He pulled himself closer, coming face to face with the woman. "Put your arms around my neck," he instructed, his voice firm but calm. "I'll get us to shore." Her lips were blue with cold, but she nodded. Without a word, she released her death grip on the wagon and reached for him. Jake felt her arms, slender but surprisingly strong, wrap around his neck. "Take a deep breath when I say," he told her, positioning himself for the swim back. "Now!" They plunged into the current together. Jake kicked with all his might, using one arm to swim while the other held the woman securely against him. The shore seemed impossibly far, the current relentlessly pulling them downstream. His lungs burned, muscles screaming with the effort, but he refused to give in. Finally, his boots scraped against the riverbed. With one final surge of strength, he staggered toward the bank, half carrying, half dragging the woman with him. They collapsed together on the muddy shore, both gasping for breath. For several long minutes, neither spoke. Jake turned his head to look at her, taking in her features for the first time. Despite being soaked and mud-splattered, she was strikingly beautiful: high cheekbones, a delicate nose, and eyes the color of summer sage. He guessed her to be in her mid-20s. "Thank you," she finally whispered, her voice hoarse. Jake nodded, still catching his breath. "What's your name, madam?" "Sarah," she replied. "Sarah Mitchell." "Jake Forrester," he said, sitting up slowly. "What in God's name were you doing crossing that river today?" Sarah pushed herself up, wringing water from her skirts. "I didn't try to cross. I was on the road when the rain started. The bank gave way beneath my wagon." She paused, looking back at the water with haunted eyes. "Everything I own was in that wagon." Jake followed her gaze. The wagon was now completely submerged. only a corner still visible above the churning water. "Where were you headed?" "Nowhere specific," she said quietly. "Just away." The resignation in her voice told him there was more to her story, but Jake wasn't one to pry. He stood, offering her his hand. "My cabin's about 3 miles from here. You can dry off, rest up." Sarah hesitated, then took his hand, allowing him to help her to her feet. She swayed slightly, and Jake caught her elbow to steady her. "Thank you, Mr. Forrester, but I wouldn't want to impose." "It's no imposition," he said simply. "And it's just Jake." He retrieved his coat from where he'd left it and draped it around her shoulders. It engulfed her smaller frame, but at least it would provide some warmth. Leading his horse back, he mounted first, then reached down to pull Sarah up behind him. "Hold on tight," he instructed, and felt her arms encircle his waist tentatively. As they rode, the rain finally began to ease. Jake felt Sarah's forehead press against his back as exhaustion overtook her. Her grip never loosened, though, and something about the trust in that simple gesture stirred something long dormant in his chest. The cabin came into view as the last light of day faded from the sky. It was small but solid, a one-room structure with a lean-to-stable attached. Jake had built it himself when he took the job at the Broken Spoke, preferring solitude to the bunkhouse. He helped Sarah down from the horse before dismounting himself. She stood silently, taking in her surroundings while Jake led his horse to the stable. "It's not much," he said upon returning, suddenly aware of the cabin's sparse appearance. "But it's dry and warm." Inside, Jake quickly built a fire in the stone hearth. Sarah stood near the door, his coat still wrapped around her shoulders, water pooling at her feet. "I've got some spare clothes you can change into," he said, digging through his trunk. He pulled out a clean shirt and a pair of trousers. "They'll be big, but they're dry." Sarah accepted them with a nod of thanks but didn't move. Understanding her hesitation, Jake said, "I'll tend to my horse. Take your time changing." When he returned from settling his gelding with fresh hay and a rubdown, Jake knocked on his own door before entering. Sarah stood by the fire in his clothes, her hair loose and damp around her shoulders. The shirt hung nearly to her knees, the sleeves rolled up several times. She'd cinched the trousers with a piece of rope. "I hung my dress to dry," she said, gesturing to where it was spread near the hearth. Jake nodded, moving to the small cupboard that served as his pantry. "You must be hungry." "I don't have much, but there's beans, some jerky, and cornbread from yesterday." "Anything would be wonderful," she said, and Jake noticed how her hands trembled slightly as she pushed her hair back from her face. They ate in comfortable silence, the only sounds the crackling of the fire and the occasional drip of water from their clothes. When Sarah had finished, she set her plate aside and finally met his eyes directly. "I don't know how to thank you properly, Mr. Jake. You saved my life today." Jake shrugged, uncomfortable with gratitude. "Anyone would have done the same." "No," she said firmly. "They wouldn't have." Something in her tone made him look up sharply. There was a shadow behind her eyes, a wariness that spoke of hard experiences. "Where are you from, Sarah?" he asked. She hesitated. "Originally, Pennsylvania. My family came west when I was 16. And now I'm just traveling." She stared into the fire. "My parents died of fever 2 years ago. There's nothing holding me anywhere specific." Jake sensed she wasn't telling the whole truth, but he respected her privacy. Everyone in these territories had stories they preferred to keep to themselves. He certainly did. "You're welcome to stay here until you figure out your next steps," he offered. "I'm out most days working, so you'd have your privacy." Sarah looked around the small cabin. "I couldn't impose like that." "It's no imposition," Jake repeated. "I can sleep in the stable." "No," she said quickly. "I won't put you out of your own bed. I can make a pallet here by the fire." Jake wanted to argue but recognized the pride in her stance. Instead, he nodded and set about making her a comfortable place to sleep with his spare blankets. That night, as Jake lay in his bed with Sarah sleeping across the room, he found himself listening to the sound of her breathing. It had been years since he'd shared space with anyone, let alone a woman. The last had been Maria, back in Texas, before everything had fallen apart. Before he'd decided that a life alone was safer for everyone involved. Yet there was something about Sarah Mitchell that called to him. Perhaps it was the quiet dignity with which she carried herself, or maybe it was simply that he'd pulled her from the river and felt responsible for her welfare. Whatever it was, he found himself wondering what her story truly was, and where she was running from. Morning dawned clear and bright, the storm having moved eastward overnight. Jake rose early, careful not to wake Sarah as he prepared coffee and a simple breakfast of bacon and the last of his cornbread. The smell eventually roused her, and she sat up, blinking in the morning light. "Good morning," Jake said, pouring her a cup of coffee. "How'd you sleep?" "Better than I expected," she admitted, accepting the cup gratefully. "Thank you." They ate breakfast together, and Jake explained that he needed to ride out to check on some cattle that might have been scattered by the storm. "I'll be back before sundown," he said, strapping on his gun belt. "Make yourself at home." Sarah nodded, still clutching her coffee cup. "Is there anything I can do while you're gone? To help, I mean." Jake glanced around the cabin. It wasn't exactly tidy, having been inhabited solely by a bachelor with minimal domestic inclinations. "Do whatever you like," he said. "You don't owe me any work." "I'd like to feel useful," she insisted. Jake nodded, understanding the need to keep busy. "Well, I wouldn't say no to a proper meal tonight if you're so inclined. Supplies are in the cupboard, and there's a small garden out back that might have survived the rain." With that, he headed out, mounting his horse with practiced ease. As he rode away, he couldn't help glancing back. Sarah stood in the doorway of his cabin, a small figure in his oversized clothes, watching him go. Something about the sight settled in his chest, warm and unfamiliar. The day passed quickly as Jake rounded up strays and repaired a section of fence that had washed out. His thoughts kept returning to Sarah, wondering what she was doing, how long she would stay, where she would go when she left. It was nearly sunset when he returned, the smell of cooking greeting him before he'd even dismounted. Inside, he found his cabin transformed. It was clean, truly clean, with everything neatly arranged. The table was set with his mismatched dishes, and Sarah stood at the small stove, stirring something that smelled better than anything he'd eaten in years. "You've been busy," he said, hanging his hat on the peg by the door. Sarah turned, a small smile on her lips. "I hope you don't mind. I found some vegetables in your garden, and there was a rabbit in one of the snares." "Mind? I might have to fish you out of rivers more often if this is the result." The joke fell awkwardly between them, but Sarah's smile widened slightly. "Sit. It's ready." The stew was rich and flavorful, with herbs Jake didn't even know he had growing near his cabin. They ate hungrily, and Jake found himself telling her about his day, about the ranch, about Wyoming Territory. Sarah listened attentively, asking occasional questions, though she shared little about herself in return. After dinner, as they sat by the fire with cups of coffee, Jake finally asked, "So what will you do now?" Sarah stared into her cup. "I'm not sure. Everything I had was in that wagon. Money, clothes, everything." "You're welcome to stay here while you figure it out," Jake offered again. "The nearest town is Pine Hollow, about 15 miles south. I could take you there tomorrow if you'd prefer." Sarah was quiet for a long moment. "If it truly isn't an imposition, I'd like to stay. Just for a few days, until I can make a plan. Jake nodded, ignoring the unexpected relief he felt. It settled then. Days turned into a week and then 2. Sarah's dress had dried, but she often wore Jake's clothes around the cabin, only changing into her own when they ventured to Pine Hollow for supplies. Jake gave her what little money he could spare, insisting she use it for fabric to make herself proper clothes. They fell into an easy routine. Jake would work during the days while Sarah kept the cabin, tended the garden, and prepared meals. In the evenings, they would sit by the fire, sometimes talking, sometimes just enjoying comfortable silence. Sarah rarely spoke about her past, and Jake never pressed. One evening, as a spring thunderstorm rattled the cabin windows, reminding them both of the day they'd met, Jake found himself telling Sarah about his own past. About growing up in Missouri, about fighting briefly in the war despite being barely 16, about drifting west afterward. He told her about the years of cowboying, the cattle drives, the countless ranches. "You never wanted to settle somewhere?" Sarah asked softly. Jake stared into the fire. "Once. In Texas." Something in his tone must have conveyed the pain associated with the memory, because Sarah didn't ask for details. Instead, she reached across the space between their chairs and briefly touched his hand, the first time she had initiated contact since he'd pulled her from the river. "Thank you for sharing that with me," she said. Jake nodded, surprised to find that the old pain had dulled somewhat in the telling. "What about you? There must be more to your story than traveling with no destination." Sarah withdrew her hand, folding it in her lap. For a long moment, Jake thought she wouldn't answer. "I was married," she finally said, her voice barely audible above the rain. "His name was Thomas. He was not a kind man." Jake felt his jaw tighten. "Is he looking for you?" Sarah shook her head. "He's dead. There was a fight in a saloon. Someone finally stood up to him and his bullying ways." She took a deep breath. "I should have felt grief, I suppose, but all I felt was relief, and shame at feeling relief." "You've nothing to be ashamed of," Jake said firmly. "The town didn't see it that way," Sarah continued. "They whispered, said I was cold, said maybe I'd had something to do with it." She looked up, meeting his eyes. "So I left, packed everything I owned in that wagon and just left." Jake understood then the wariness, the reluctance to share her story, the way she'd been running with no destination in mind. Freedom was still new to her, and she was learning to trust it, to trust herself. "Well," he said after a moment, "you're welcome here for as long as you want to stay." Sarah's eyes shimmered in the firelight. "Thank you," she whispered. As spring turned to summer, their lives remained intertwined. Jake continued his work at the ranch, while Sarah transformed his simple cabin into a home. She planted more vegetables in the garden, made curtains for the windows from fabric bought in town, and even managed to acquire a few chickens from a neighboring ranch in exchange for some of her preserves. They still slept separately, Sarah on a proper cot now instead of a pallet, Jake in his bed, but their evenings were spent together, talking, reading from Jake's small collection of books, or simply enjoying each other's company. Jake found himself hurrying home each day, eager to see what changes Sarah might have made, what she might have cooked, or simply to see her smile of welcome when he walked through the door. It was a feeling he hadn't experienced in years, this anticipation, this sense of having someone waiting for him. For her part, Sarah seemed to blossom as the weeks passed. The shadows in her eyes grew less frequent, her smiles more ready. She hummed while she worked, songs Jake didn't recognize but loved to hear. Sometimes, he would pause outside the cabin before entering, just to listen to her moving about inside, marveling at how quickly her presence had become essential to him. Neither of them spoke about the future or put a name to what was growing between them. It was as if they had a silent agreement to simply live in the present, day by day, neither pushing for more nor preparing for an end. It was a warm July evening when everything changed. Jake had returned from work earlier than usual, having completed his tasks with uncommon efficiency. He'd found Sarah at the creek that ran behind the cabin, washing clothes. Her hair was tied back loosely, tendrils escaping to frame her face, and she'd rolled up the sleeves of his old shirt that she still preferred to wear for chores. "You're back early," she said, smiling up at him. Jake nodded, squatting down beside her. "Thought I might help you with these." Sarah laughed, the sound like music to his ears. "You doing laundry? I'd like to see that. I'll have you know I washed my own clothes for years before you came along," he protested, though he was smiling too. "Yes, and I saw the results," she teased, flicking water at him. Jake raised his eyebrows in mock offense before scooping up a handful of water and splashing her lightly. Sarah gasped, then immediately retaliated. Within moments, they were engaged in a full water fight, laughing like children. When Jake finally caught her hands to stop the onslaught, they were both soaked and breathless with laughter. The moments stretched between them, their smiles fading as awareness dawned. They were close, too close, her wrists still caught gently in his hands, her eyes wide and questioning. Jake released her slowly. "Sarah," he said, his voice rough with emotion he'd kept contained for months. She didn't back away. Instead, she lifted one hand to his face, her fingers trembling slightly as they traced his jawline. "I've wanted to do that for so long," she whispered. Jake covered her hand with his own, turning his face to press a kiss to her palm. "I've wanted to let you." Their first kiss was tentative, a gentle exploration. Their second was not. Years of loneliness and months of growing affection poured into the connection between them. When they finally parted, both breathing heavily, Jake rested his forehead against hers. "I love you," he said simply. "I think I have since I pulled you from that river." Sarah's eyes filled with tears, but she was smiling. "I've loved you just as long. I just didn't know how to say it." "You didn't have to say it," Jake replied, brushing a tear from her cheek. "You showed it every day, in 1,000 small ways." That night, for the first time, they shared Jake's bed, not as strangers brought together by circumstance, but as two people who had chosen each other, who had found in each other a home neither had believed possible. As summer waned, they spoke more openly of the future. Jake had been saving to buy his own small ranch one day, and now that dream included Sarah. "I want to marry you properly," he told her one evening as they sat on the porch watching the sunset. "If you'll have me." Sarah turned to him, her eyes soft in the fading light. "Are you proposing to me, Jake Forrester?" "I reckon I am," he replied, taking her hand. "What do you say?" Her answer was a kiss that told him everything he needed to know. They were married in Pine Hollow on a crisp September day. The ceremony was small, just the two of them, the preacher, and a few friends Jake had made at the ranch. Sarah wore a new dress she'd sewn herself, and Jake wore the only suit he owned, purchased years ago for a funeral and now repurposed for a happier occasion. That winter, they remained in Jake's cabin, planning and saving for their future ranch. The small space that had once felt more than adequate to Jake now seemed filled to bursting with love, with plans, with the life they were building together. When spring arrived again, bringing with it the anniversary of their meeting, Jake took Sarah to the river. It had returned to its normal flow, peaceful and unassuming, giving no hint of the fury it had unleashed a year before. "It's hard to believe," Sarah said, standing at the spot where Jake had pulled her from the water. "If you hadn't come along when you did." Jake wrapped his arms around her from behind, resting his chin on her shoulder. "Maybe it was fate." Sarah turned in his arms, smiling up at him. "I never took you for a man who believed in fate." "I believe in this," he said, kissing her softly. "In us." They stood there for a long time, the river flowing steadily beside them, a reminder of how their lives had converged and been forever altered in a single moment of courage and desperation. By the following year, they had saved enough for a down payment on a small parcel of land about 10 miles from Pine Hollow. It wasn't much, just 100 acres with a dilapidated house and barn, but it was theirs. They worked tirelessly to make it habitable, repairing the house, clearing fields, acquiring a small herd of cattle and a few horses. The day they moved from Jake's cabin to their new home, Sarah stood in the doorway of the place where she had first found sanctuary, a hand resting lightly on her growing belly. "Ready?" Jake asked, loading the last of their belongings onto the wagon. Sarah nodded, blinking back tears. It's silly to be emotional about leaving. This place was only ever temporary. Jake came to stand beside her, his hand covering hers over their unborn child. "Nothing about what happened here was temporary," he said softly. As they drove away, Sarah leaned against Jake's shoulder, secure in the knowledge that home wasn't a place but the love they had built without words, beginning with a desperate rescue on a flooded river. It was a love that would sustain them through all the seasons of their lives together, through the birth of their children, through the growth of their ranch, through all the joys and sorrows that lay ahead. And though many years would pass and much would change, they would always remember how it began. With a river, a rescue, and two hearts finding in each other what they had never thought to find: a love that required no words to be understood, and a belonging that would last forever.